Hello, class. Here I am again, week two, and what I'm going to do now is talk about some poems that exhibit good examples of figurative language, metaphors, similes, and personification. And I'd like to start out by talking about not so much reading, but talking about a poem I read last week, which is Mirror by Sylvia Plath. The video is still there for it from week one. The link to the poem is there, but I just wanted to talk about some of the figurative language, strong figurative language in this poem. The second stanza begins, "Now I am a lake." You remember that the speaker of the poem is the mirror itself, and now, by an extended metaphor, the mirror becomes a lake. The mirror is saying, "Now I am a lake." A woman bends over me, searching my reaches for what she really is. Then she turns to those liars, the candles or the moon. That also is a metaphor. The moon and the candles are described as being liars. Why liars? Because they shine with a false light. They don't reflect. They can't reflect the woman as the mirror can. She turns to those liars, the candles or the moon. At the very end of the poem, still maintaining the mirror as lake metaphor, are the lines, "In me she has drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman rises towards her day after day like a terrible fish." How does she drown the young girl? Because the woman in the mirror ages, and the girl that she once was disappears and is replaced by, the aging face of the woman who, again, the mirror as a lake, is rising towards the surface day after day like a terrible fish, which is a fairly, remarkable, simile to end the poem with. I'm going to continue from there with another Sylvia Plath poem. And this one is called Metaphors. So there's a clue right there what's going on. As I read it, count the number of lines. I'll give a pause at the end of each line. That is sort of a clue. Each image in the poem, each line is a metaphor for one thing. And see if you can figure out what that one thing is. Metaphors. I'm a riddle in 9 syllables, an elephant, a ponderous house, a melon strolling on 2 tendrils. Oh, red fruit, ivory, fine timbers, this loaf's big with its yeasty rising. Money's new minted in this fat purse. I'm a means, a stage, a cow and calf. I've eaten a bag of green apples, boarded the train, there's no getting off. All right, so consider that poem and, read it yourselves and see if you can determine what the poem, what image, what these images represent, what their metaphors for. All right. And by the way, I also posted a Sylvia Plath poem, a link of her reading her poem "Daddy," famous poem. Take a look at that with the very strong metaphors concerning her father, in whom she felt emotionally abandoned by because he died. But as you watch that video, it's a very powerful video. Determine or see if you can listen for what some of the metaphors, some of the figurative language is in that. I'm next going to read a famous poem by Langston Hughes called Harlem. Langston Hughes was an African American poet who lived from the early part of the 20th century until like the late 1960s. So he became prominent as a poet before World War II, and then through the war years into afterwards. One of the great voices in African American art. Harlem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? He does something interesting in this poem. Count the similes. A dream deferred, a dream set aside, or a dream not realized. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, simile 1, or fester like a sewer, then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. And if I counted those correctly, there are 5 similes that ends up to an implied metaphor at the end. Or does it explode? That's the implied metaphor that it is very much like a ticking time bomb that's going to explode one way or another in time. Simile, 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 metaphor. The metaphor is stronger than the similes because it's not saying something is like something, it's saying something is something. Interesting poem. And I'm going to conclude by reading actually the first 2 stanzas of a poem by T.S. Eliot. The poem is titled The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Okay? Listen to the figurative language in this. I'll start off by reading the first stanza. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask it. What is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. All right, that's the first stanza of the poem. It starts with a really striking simile. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Remarkable simile. If you think about like the evening sky spread out like a patient etherized who is preparing for an operation to be operated upon. There's also a simile later in the stanza comparing like the half-deserted streets to those half-deserted streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent. So comparing the streets to a tedious argument of insidious intent, something that's going to lead you, basically nowhere. The next stanza of the poem is a wonderful example of personification. Right? The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once around the house and fell asleep. So the fog is being described in the way almost like it's a cat. The yellow fog rubs its back upon the window panes, rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, and then at the end curled once about the house and fell asleep. Wonderful personification there. It's giving fog, which is an inanimate object, the characteristics of a living animal. Okay, that's T.S. Eliot. All these poems, as I did last week, will be linked, and take a read of them yourself and enjoy.